Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War news update, the first part thereof for the 23rd of August 2025. I'm terribly sorry this is somewhat later than it should be. I keep waking up more exhausted than when I go to bed at the moment. I don't know what's wrong with me. Hey ho. So let's go to the Ukrainian General Staff figures for the day before, all the usual caveats apply. Of course, we can see that 840 personnel were lost. That's up from yesterday, very low number comparatively speaking yesterday. 840 is below the 1,000 threshold, still a significant number, right? But not as high as we have been used to. Remember, it's got as high as 1,700 previously. So there have been some horrific days for the Ukrainians. For the Russians, and this is nowhere near that, but it's still a significant number. 5 tanks is okay. It's half the daily average. Actually, I don't know what the daily average is at the moment. I wonder whether it's come back down. In fact, let's have a look at the daily average. Remember that linked in the description below are Dell's stats, and he updates these on a daily basis. I'd love to go out with for a pint with him, but he's just moved away. He was living quite near me, and we had the occasional pint together. Anyway, if we look at the tanks data, let's take my ugly mug out of this. You can see that they've really seriously dropped. I mean, really dropped there. So we had that purple patch for the Ukrainians around here, sort of counterattack period, and there onwards. Although from that period the trend was downwards, because that was a really high period of Russian losses where the Russians started attacking places like Avdiivka and were losing all sorts of stuff. Even though they made these gains eventually, there were huge losses for them. That's really dropped off a cliff. When we go to the actual data sheet, we can look at the averages. So if we highlight the tanks average here over on the left hand side, you can see over on the right, that's interesting. So the daily average has gone to 8.71. So when I last looked at the daily average for tanks, it was about 11. So it's dropped probably 2.5 in the average daily losses, which represents the tank losses going right down. You know, you look at the trend line going really, really significant, precipitously dropping there, and that's reflected in the averages. If we look at the APVs or AFVs, we can see a similar scenario, exactly the same scenario there. Actually personnel, if we look at the personnel averages, so remember each orange bar is a daily loss stat from the general staff figures. So he takes it from that infographic or from the released figures, and then adds it to the daily list here, and then we have a total. The shallower the blue line, the fewer the losses. The steeper the line, the heavier the losses. So you can see the blue line is probably steepest in gradient around here, and that's reflected in these losses in the orange bars. And then as the orange bars start going down, the trend line, this dotted purple line, starts coming down as well. So if we go back to the data, the average losses for tanks, 8.71. That used to be about 11. The average for APVs, if we go to that row, is now 18. Wow, that used to be, I think it got as high as, it was in the 20s. Artillery was around, that's gone up to, so when I was last looking, it was sort of 21 on, then it went up to 25, and now it's around 24.89 there. So so that's about 25. So that's a high average for artillery losses. But the averages for both AFVs or APVs and tanks has gone down, and that is, all of this tells us a story, right? And the story here is going to be that the Russians are using vehicles and fuel tanks for their attacks predominantly. However, those numbers, if we look at the average for vehicles and fuel tanks, I know my head's almost in the way there. The average here is 46.55. So anything over 46 is going to send the average up. But actually, when you look at the losses for vehicles, that's because at the beginning of the war, vehicles and fuel tanks were not a thing that were lost. So if you remember right at the beginning of the war, the Russians weren't using SUVs, they weren't using motorcycles, quads, golf buggies, Bukankers, none of that really. It's a few of them will be used, and there'll be, but basically most of these losses here would be fuel tanks. So actually trucks trucks with fuel in and logistics trucks. That's what all of these orange entries will be. From sort of really the first half of this for the first half of this graph. When you start getting to halfway, you can't, for some reason, there cursors. So this area, these will be fuel tanks. When you get to halfway, you're starting to see Russia run out of things like fuel tanks, run low on them, start using for logistics, bukankers and SUVs, and then you start seeing these get lost on tremendous levels. Then they begin to use golf buggies, the Desert Cross 1000-3s, and then quads and all sorts. And we had a very high sort of a peak time in earlier this year, sort of springtime this year, and that has dropped off as well, a couple of spikes, but essentially actually those numbers have dropped too. So even though the Russians have been relying much more on these kinds of vehicles, so you see the peak in springtime there, we go to APVs. The peak for APVs is much earlier, so it has been dropping before the peak that you see, and the same with the tanks. So really interesting to look at these graphs, because it really does give you a sense of what's going on. So they started losing huge amounts of tanks and IFVs over here as they were attacking all sorts of places. Avdiivka, this is post Bakhmut. Bakhmut, they didn't really use much mechanized equipment at all, actually. It was all infantry led, and they lost huge numbers of infantry there. In fact, if we go to the personnel figures, you'll probably see that I imagine that's going to be Bakhmut over there, and then different spikes here and there. I don't know what that blue square is doing. And then so if we go back to vehicles and fuel tanks, now you're seeing a drop-off of even vehicles and fuel tanks, and my guess is going to be that the Russians are just using fewer of those as well. So yes, they are using motorcycles and bukankers and larders and whatnot, but I think many of their attacks are simply infantry-led. That's maybe a change that you've seen. Right, okay. 23 artillery systems, 4 troop-carrying AFVs. So actually the artillery systems number there is fairly low. That's below the daily average. That's significant. So although that seems comparatively a lot compared to, say, tanks and troop-carrying AFVs, it is comparatively low. Vehicles and fuel tanks, 86. That's below the 100. Sometimes we've seen it well over 200, right? So even though that's higher than the daily average, in the context of the whole war, you would expect the every day to be well above the daily average. In fact, you would hope every day would be above 100. This could show that it's quieter along the front line than it has been. It could show that the Russians aren't attacking as much, but it could also show that they are mainly using infantry rather than any kind of equipment, mechanized equipment. Okay, hopefully that all made sense. So now we go on to look at a few data points. The bad news for the Ukrainians today, this is probably the worst bit of news for the Ukrainians, is the death of a very experienced MiG-29 fighter jet pilot. And it looks like, yet again, it's one that wasn't involved in combat. Well, it was involved in a combat mission, but it was returning, and something went wrong with the landing, and unfortunately died. And I presume the plane is also no more. This is Major Serhiy Bondar. He devoted his entire life to aviation, worked as a lecturer at the National Aviation University. A MiG-29 fighter jet that carried out daily combat work to protect the airspace of Ukraine. Wife, son and daughter are left. Sad news there for the Ukrainians, because these pilots and these planes, specifically these older planes, the chances of getting them replaced, although Poland does have some MiG-29s, I think, that could be brought to bear in Ukraine, but it's the loss of the pilot that's going to be really significant here, especially one who is so experienced, 46-year-old, who has sadly passed away. Possibly landing gear didn't come down or something, I don't know, but it was on the landing part of the mission there. Okay, so Andrew Perpetua and David D have some kind of anecdotal things to say. Andrew here saying, I think it's safe to say the Russians overextended themselves. Right, I'm going to do a mapping update today. I think it's really important I do so, because I've been saying for a couple of days, it looks like the Ukrainians have been poking the Russians in a number of places and pushing back, and sometimes getting through quite easily, or at least, there isn't the depth of defense in the Russian lines, rather like the Ukrainian lines. My opinion has been that both sides have been massively overstretched. The Ukrainians have been relying on drone warfare to do their defensive work rather than troops on the ground. And that means that their defensive lines are fairly brittle and can be broken if you can burst through those drone lines. And you can do that if you're moving quickly, such as on motorcycles and quads and whatnot. So the Russians are getting away with actually making gains without too many people. They just break through, and then once they've done the breakthrough, this is what was the plan, I guess, for the Dobropilya axis, was you make the breakthrough quickly and then you exploit it. So they did that on foot, actually, trying to do it quite quietly or in a clandestine fashion, and then you break through with more mechanized equipment. Maybe motorcycles and quads come next, and then mechanized equipment, then you bring in the artillery and so on and so forth. And those exploitation troops fortify that expanded territory. But they don't do it with huge numbers of troops, and they can do that because the Ukrainians don't have huge numbers of defensive troops. And so like I said to you yesterday, the war is a game of attrition chicken. Actually, I'd said that a couple of years ago as well. I'm not suddenly changing my opinion on this war. Like, the data's always shown that it's who can lose the fewest number of troops over the longest period. And traditionally, the Ukrainians have had a better loss ratio than the Russians. The Russians used to lose huge amounts of troops and equipment, but they've been able to sustain those losses by just pumping in more troops and equipment. Problem now for the Russians is that they seem to be running out of equipment, as all the data suggests, and Covert Cabal does the analysis of the deep storage. They're running out of equipment. They're trying to use different equipment to do that, so they can get hold of motorbikes and buggies more easily, and they're using that kind of equipment, but they're predominantly still needing those troops, and they appear to be struggling to recruit, I think, to the same levels that they previously were, and morale is low, and people don't want to go on meat assaults, and yet that's the way that they are making those gains. And if the Ukrainians can hold out, then there's some kind of Pyrrhic situation where the Russians overextend themselves, are thinly aligned along the front line, and then the Ukrainians can, in certain places, choose to punch through those weakened positions. And I think that's what Andrew Papench is saying. I think it's safe to say the Russians overextended themselves. So someone says they've been on the offensive non-stop for 2 years now. It's amazed me that they haven't paused for even a moment. I can only imagine the toll it's taken on the Russian army. I think you just completely ignore the long breaks they took of not attacking and are only remembering the things you have personal emotional attachments to and not reality. So, Andrew's saying, look, there are times where they have not attacked nearly quite so much. Now, David D, who's very much a more positive person, take what he says with a massive pinch of salt, and he's always on the positive side of Ukraine. But I think there's something in this. So I'm just going to say it, says David D. A slow-rolling front-wide summer offensive by the AFU has started. We are seeing recon, counter-recon battles all along the front. Many areas there is little or no real Russian defences, and the 5th Brigade is cutting into the Russians tonight, he says. Reports are coming in that the 70th Regiment has pulled back, so that's Russians. Many of the Russian divisions holding the line are being broken up to fill holes way out of sector, like the 7th VDV division. They're not the only ones. From many reports of Russian Marines, this is up in Sumy by the looks of it. Yes. And the 30th Regiment are combat ineffective and are being evac'd back to Russia under fire. Small offensive probes by the AFU near Chaziv Yar, he says. Ongoing counterattack in the Bilahora area, so that's just around north of Toretsk, basically. 132nd Russian Regiment and support forces in the Bunny Ear, so that's where they attacked near Dobropilya, are reportedly being reduced to nothing by the 1st Corps. So we had Dimko Zhultenko saying yesterday that they were killing Russians on industrial scales in that area. 14th and National Guards Brigade attacking the 51st Russian Corps area. The 51st has no more reserve units to counter with, if the map is correct. 155th is counter-attacking and retaking land, so that's the 155th Ukrainian, not 155th National Naval Infantry Brigade up in Sumy. These are the 155th, the kind of ones trained in France, the Lady of Kiev, I think they were called. They were then positioned around Prokrovsk. They're counterattacking, retaking land where the Russians have thrown out about a regiment into without getting anything south of the city of Prokrovsk. How big is the attack? How many units and where will this go? No one knows, but something is happening. And the fact that Ukraine has a reserve force they can use to attack and Russia does not have a reserve force, they can move to counter with that they move without weakening a sector of the front. If I'm right, this month Ukraine should be able to take more land than Russia. We will see. So take this all with a pinch of salt, but he's very sort of positive about where Ukraine are at right now. And in fact, he said something else. No, I don't have it here. There was another post that I thought was quite interesting, talking about the predicament that Russia are in, but no, I can't find it. Anyway, so I'm looking forward to doing a frontline update to see whether any of this is borne out by movements on the map. Now, then you put it together with something like this. So I said the other day that the Ukrainians had attacked across the Kherson River and had taken some land, don't really know where, taken some prisoners. And I thought that was interesting. Now, the Crimean Tatar Partisan movement in Attrition, which fights on Ukraine's side, has released a statement regarding the left bank of the river, of the Dnipro River. Quote, Attrition agents report that employees of the occupation administrations and deputies from Holopristan, Kharkovka, Novokharkovka and Hornostaivka have begun. So these are areas on the left bank of the river, which is actually the right-hand side if you're looking at a north-south map. But you do left-right bank as the river flows, so you can always know there's no change by the direction of the river. The left and right bank are always the left and right bank, whereas if a river meanders and does an oxbow lake, like the east bank of the river and the west bank of the river can be the different side of the river depending on which direction the river is going. Anyway, most of you will know that by now. So the left bank of the river, which is on the right-hand side, have the settlements, obviously, that the Russians occupy, but the administrations from there are sending their families back to Crimea. We call on the collaborators, they say, who consciously began cooperating with the Russians. You still have a chance to take the path of correction. Contact us. So in other words, if you are collaborators that have been working with the Russians, come and work for us now, because maybe the tide is turning and your path of correction is still available to you. Anyway, interesting anecdote there. Now let's look at the loss stats, because this should tell us a story as well. Okay, so we have an air defense unit destroyed. That's good news for the Ukrainians, but we do not have a lot of infantry mobility vehicles or classic combat assets for the Russians other than artillery. Exactly what I've been saying for the last however many weeks is that the Russians are just simply not using them. Is it because they can't use them? Is it because motorcycles and quads are better? Is it because they're forced to use motorcycles and quads and actually they can be better? Is it because they're stockpiling and reserving equipment? That would seem pretty weird. Is it because they're not attacking? Is it because the momentum is shifted and they're on defense? And when you're on defense, you don't generally lose equipment like this. And then when you look at the Ukrainian equipment losses, yet again, we have another day of MRAPs and fairly high MRAPs, not as high as yesterday, and infantry mobility losses. But those are the sorts of bits of equipment you lose when you're attacking. It's exactly what I said yesterday. So just by looking at these stats and then looking at all these other data points, I would suggest that the Ukrainians probably have been attacking for the last week, really. Now, we know they've been attacking in the Prokrovsk area, and they are going to have been using equipment like this. So I know I've been speaking to people, I've been speaking to Pierre about the losses and trying to understand why there are these much higher losses. And you can read this negatively. You can say that the Ukraine are losing against the Russians. The Russians are doing better than the Ukrainians. I would not interpret it like that. I would genuinely think that the Ukrainians are on the attack. And here's another data point to support what I'm saying, hopefully. So, and actually Pierre sent me this, and thanks to Pierre for this. This is really significant. So this is an area apparently recaptured by Ukrainian forces. So one, we know that Ukrainian forces are recapturing areas, and you can't recapture areas unless you're attacking. And you generally can't attack unless you can move your troops from A to B, and you can't move your troops from A to B unless you're the Russians without using mobility vehicles. Okay, so in order to take these areas, therefore, my theory would be that the Ukrainians are using MRAPs and mobility vehicles, right? And they've recaptured areas. Then the Russians are using massive loads of FABs. So these are guided glide bombs. We don't often see pictures of these. We are starting to see a lot more imagery of the Ukrainians using guided glide bombs, and they are shouting about them. They're using them successfully. The Russians are still using them. Pierre said 130 a day, so a lot a day. And they're using them to take out, as I suggest the Ukrainians should. Why I've been saying for some time now that the Ukrainians need a game-changing situation of another 70 aircraft is because they need the aircraft and the bombs to be able to do this to the Russians on the front line. So the Ukrainians, because they have fewer guided glide bombs to be able to throw and fewer planes to throw those bombs, they are, I suggest, again, this is my speculation, I'm no expert, but I suggest that the Ukrainians are hitting high value targets like command nodes, and that seems to be what's happening. So command nodes and UAV operators, so drone operators, those are the sorts of things. And so you see these big buildings get taken out by the guided glide bombs, and they absolutely shellac them, and it looks great and fantastic. Well done, Ukraine. What they're probably not doing, although I've seen it a couple of times, there is some imagery of it, but it's not like widespread, is using them on, say, tree lines and dugouts and stuff like that, where that's where the Russians use them, and they use them because they have so many of these bombs and more planes to be able to drop them. So here we have an area that Ukrainians have retaken, and then the Russians absolutely hammer them with guided glide bombs. Then if you're going to be having, infantry mobility vehicles getting your troops from A to B, and this is the B, then you're probably going to be losing vehicles to, probably not to the guided glide bombs, but the Russians will also be hitting these positions with drones, and particularly the Vandal drones. So then you've got the Russian Vandal drones that are slightly longer distance hitting your logistics further behind the line. So let's look at the Ukrainian losses. So we go, okay, UGVs, yep, we've talked about that lots. We've got surveillance and comms, yep, okay, we're kind of ignoring that, although it's important, blah, blah, blah. Some artillery pieces, an AS-90, UK provided one there, but, damaged, but generally pretty standard. A single tank for the Ukrainians, a single infantry fighting vehicle. So they're not like clearing out lines with these vehicles, as you might expect in maneuver warfare, but they are losing these MRAPs. And I suggest MRAPs are your logistics getting troops from A to B. So these are hit by night vision drones, night vision Vandal drone, abandoned, then hit by FPV drones, abandoned probably because they've been hit by another drone, but you don't know. And some of these will be double counted as well. So that's something to note. I assume some of these MRAPs would have been on previous lists of MRAPs as hit by an FPV drone, and then they're abandoned. And then you see them get hit by another FPV drone once they've been abandoned. So beware that it might not be that all of these MRAPs are new MRAPs for the list. They could be double counted because they're hit on separate occasions. So you hit them, people then get out of them, abandon them, run into tree lines, or get evac somewhere else. And then you get an FPV drone footage hitting an empty, abandoned MRAP. And so it's like clock. Okay. So you got Vandal drones down here on mobility vehicles like Humvees, fiber optic drones, night vision FPV drones, Vandal drones, night vision FPV drones, pickup trucks. So again, a lot of these vehicles, and there are a lot of them. So look at the number of vehicles that the Ukrainians have on the list here. These will be used in the same way that Humvees are used to get troops and supplies from A to B during counterattacks. I think you're seeing a much larger number of vehicles here because there are more vehicles in the areas where the Russians have drones than there were previously. And that's because the Ukrainians have moved those vehicles into there because they're counterattacking. It's probably not that the Russians have expanded their drone range significantly such that over the last couple of weeks, suddenly they've got another 10 kilometer of drone coverage, although that is possible. There is a drone war going on where each side is trying to get an asymmetrical advantage. So the Ukrainians might have realized that the Russians have way more success with fiber optic drones, and then they're trying to play catch up with them. But that means that you're going to get more vehicles taken out by Russian fiber optic drones and vice versa, so on and so forth. So loads of caveats and all sorts. But my general thesis is that this suggests that the Ukrainians are attacking. So losing more vehicles is not always a bad thing. I mean, it's obviously bad that you're losing vehicles, but you lose vehicles when you attack. And what it signifies is that you're attacking. And if you're attacking, that's a good thing because you have the momentum, you have the initiative. right? If Ukraine always sit in defense, oh, brilliant, they don't lose any mobility vehicles, well done, but they don't retake any land. So you exchange land for losses. Now, the Russians have exchanged an awful lot of land. Well, it depends what you talk, whether 1% of Ukraine is an awful lot of land. The Russians swap land for huge losses. Hopefully the Ukrainians are, and particularly in personnel terms, hopefully the Ukrainians are swapping land for mobility vehicle losses that are things like MRAPs that allow their troops to survive, and the personnel losses are not the same as the Russian personnel losses in terms of men per square kilometre. Okay. Now going on to the Russian losses, we've got a Buk M3 lost. That's significant. And then some surveillance and comms equipment. You've got a Niobe SV radar there. That's the Nebo, I think, radar array thing that is very, very expensive. So that's a really good, if I'm correct in that, that's a very good loss for the Ukrainians to have taken. We've got a BM-27 Uragan. This is quite a rare one on a rare chassis. But anyway, that's a multiple launch rocket system, totally destroyed. And then another bunch of artillery pieces taken out. A single tanker T-90M destroyed. So that's interesting. You might see more of them as a proportion of the losses. You might not see more lost. It's not that they're using more, it's that they've lost more of the others, so that when they do lose a T-90M, it takes up a larger proportion of the tank losses because they're losing fewer tanks, but the same amount of T-90Ms, if you get what I'm saying, because they cycled through their older tanks. Then you've got a couple of trucks, and then we're down to the ATVs, motorcycles, four-wheelers, and then civilian vehicles. Not as many as we've seen before. Again, refer you to my previous rationale. Okay. Then we're going to go on to some more data points. Explosion in Luhansk region, Russian war criminals, enemy pickup trucks, and a Bukanka with ammunition destroyed in Kaliningrad, according to the GUR. Now, this is particularly significant because I think this looks like a bit of sabotage rather than striking with some kind of drone or something. So, and also because they know that these are war criminals from Bucha, right? The detonation occurred in the courtyard of one of the houses where 6 Russian invaders were with their military transport. In 2022, the above mentioned Russian invaders took a direct part in committing war crimes in the city of Bucha. So this is a retributive precision attack in some way. An explosion in occupied Kaliningrad, Luhansk region destroyed 3 Russian air defense troops involved in Bucha war crimes, along with 2 enemy pickups and a UAZ van loaded with ammunition. 2 more Russians were seriously wounded. So some kind of undercover operation has taken place there. Good news for the Ukrainians. Right, Jakub Janovsky from Onyx says this from Oryx. Sorry, this is just another anecdote. So he's referring to a Quiso wiki thread that we're going to go through. So impossible to know how common it is, but sending tank crews into assaults while most of the unit tanks sit far in the rear is definitely an interesting way to operate a tank unit. Now, I have I been through this one, or I think I've read it myself. Quite similar to previous ones, but worth going through. So this guy, and I always wonder whether Russians should do this. They're probably going to get hauled out and then thrown in a Zindan. But Russian tank crewman in the Prokrovsk region says that things are not going well there. Again, all the other data points that we've been looking at. Only 2 of his unit's 16 tanks are operational. So that is 1/8 of the tanks in his unit operational. That's absolutely shocking. There aren't enough men to operate the rest. So when we're not seeing tank losses, what I've been talking about is the fact that they don't have them. Actually, what this anecdote suggests, or this data point suggests, is that particularly in one unit, they've got the tanks, they just don't have the ability to repair them or the ability to man them. So only 2 are operational. There aren't enough men to operate the rest. And the tankers at the front line are being expended as assault troops instead. The unidentified man who says he is in a tank unit somewhere near Prokrovsk says, quote, well, we have no one left to send. We have no effing crews at all. Of the 3 effing companies left there, well, we can put together a company. The shortage of personnel means that 3/4 of the unit's tanks have had to be left at Attrition in the Russian far rear, south of Luhansk city. The remaining 1/4 are at the front line in a plantation, but half of those don't work. Right now, quote, right now we have 4 here hidden in the forest. 2 more are being still being repaired, and the rest, 12 tanks, F, are in and transit. Only 2 are operational right now, F. So many men are either injured or have deserted that there aren't enough to operate the remaining tanks, says Chris Owicki. Quote, they gathered us, the first company, F. They gathered everyone from 3 companies, F. Well, there are no people left. Some are wounded, some are effing 500, so deserters. Cargo 200 are dead, 300 are wounded, 500 are deserters. I guess 400 is probably POWs. Some are effing who knows what. Well, they're in Anthracite. I don't know yet, but we don't have any people at all, F. I don't know where they'll put 12 tanks unless they put 1 person in each tank. At the same time, commanders are sending the few remaining tank crew into infantry assaults. Quote, well, they scare the F out of us with assaults too, F. Well, while we're standing here, our infantry is effing fighting over there. We sometimes go out and work with them. So you put that together with with Andrew Perpetua saying they are overstretched. This is data to confirm or to validate that claim that they're overstretched. It also tells us why there are fewer tank losses, both in terms of the general staff figures and with Andrew Perpetua's loss lists. And then that we can then say, well, look, if the Ukrainians are losing more than the Russians, it might well be that the Ukrainians simply have more than the Russians to be able to lose. And it shows that they're able to use them. So again, it fits into this, well, you're more able to attack if you have more troops and more equipment. And so we might be going into a phase of a change of momentum here. And this is pretty usual for war, right? One side goes until they need to recuperate, regenerate losses, sort out their supply routes, get logistics in, and then the other side go on the attack, and then that goes on until they run out of momentum and they culminate, and then the initiative changes and the momentum shifts to the other side, and so on and so forth. And that's how it's been during this war. The question is, how long can each side go on the attack? Russia's been able to expend more troops and keep that momentum up for longer, but at huge costs. And you get to this point in the war, maybe, where those huge costs are starting to show along the front lines. But again, am I being too hopeful? So moving on from that, we've got another example of a horrific war crime. This is the Russians killing an old Ukrainian lady pulling a shopping cart or a suitcase, murdered by Russian soldiers. This is the reality of Russia's war of annihilation against the Ukrainian people. This happens all the time, and it's disgusting, and war crime after war crime after war crime. Now, there's been another death in Russia. I don't know if it's at all controversial. I think he had, well, according to one media outlet, I think he had a long-standing illness. But the Russian media, they are reporting the death of a propagandist called Kirill Vyshinsky. In Moscow, he led RIA Novosti, Ukraine, supported the annexation of Crimea, and after a 2019 prison swap became executive director of Russia Today and editor-in-chief of Sputnik. So this is a big guy in the Russian information space, and he has died. So yeah, is that all too convenient, or was it genuinely an illness? Right, we're moving on to distant strikes. Russia last night, again, another night of not too much. So I don't think they're able. If you could, you answer, you can't. So they are unable to fire huge numbers on consecutive nights at the moment. We did have 574 the other night, and then it dropped precipitously down from there. The night before that, there was a few hundred before. So you had a couple of days of the Russians exhausting their stockpiles, and then they have to then fly just a few and then try and regenerate those stockpiles. Presumably, but it would be worse than this, but the Ukrainians have had success in taking out the production and supply chains for these drones. 36 of the 49 were shot down or suppressed across the northeastern center. 13 drones managed to hit sites in Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk and Sumy regions, so fairly close to the front lines, and that's fairly typical, much harder to intercept. Now, we hear that Russia is recruiting. We've heard this previously, but we're hearing it again. Russia is recruiting South African women to work at Yelabuga drone factory. South African authorities have launched an investigation, according to Bloomberg. In January, BRICS Students Commission, which is an entity of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, so the group of these countries. The BRICS Student Commission began distributing job advertisements for girls aged 18 to 22 in construction and service sector in Yelabuga. So recruitment is also being promoted via Instagram and TikTok. Up to 90% of the recruited employees work in the assembly of Shahed 136s. Housing is being built in Yelabuga for tens of thousands of new workers, says Max 25, which according to analysts is associated with the expansion of military production. So, we have seen the footage of the drone manufacturing facility. Some of you said it was AI because I guess you didn't want to admit that they have successfully built such a massive place, but they have. I mean, you look at the satellite data, you look at the video data, you look at the production numbers of the Shaheds, you look at the ability for Russia to send 500, 600 odd drones in a single night now compared to the beginning of the war, where the war, or earlier in the war, where they were clearly not able to do that. They have massively built up production. Ukraine's number one priority at the moment is to stop that production, in my opinion, and to meet that production they need the personnel, but of course there is a worker shortage in Ukraine due to the war, and so they're having to bring in people. We've heard about 25,000 coming from North Korea. You're not going to fit 25,000 people from North Korea in Yelabuga unless Yelabuga is freaking massive, and it is freaking massive. And on top of the manufacturing facilities, you have the Yelabuga SEZ, the Special Economic Zone, which is a huge logistics area and business area, commercial industrial area to support the actual assembly and manufacturing over there. Okay, so I just want to show you this. This is from, I don't know when this is from, whether it was yesterday or the day before, but that is a missile slamming into Konstantinivka right near the front line, into an apartment block there. Not everyone has been evacuated from the city. The old especially cannot bear to leave. And in fact, there are quite a few still in Konstantinivka. As you'd expect, it's a pretty substantial place. Do you remember? Well, yeah, it's just, yeah, this was the staging ground for Chasiv Yar, when Chasiv Yar was a staging ground for Bakhmut. So now that Chasiv Yar is under attack, Konstantinivka is much closer to the front line. It's getting absolutely hammered. And you can see hashtag Russia is a terrorist state as they slam missiles into apartment blocks. Kramatorsk has been absolutely battered over the last 24 hours. 40 aerial explosions were recorded as Russia pummeled the city, which is equally close to the front line there in that semicircle of cities, with artillery and also FPV drones. They are close enough to now get FPV drones into the city. Russia is wiping out the city, says Max 25, talking of Kramatorsk. Over 30 explosions, we heard 40 from Tim, were heard in Kramatorsk. The Russians attacked the city, according to the city council. And then a video from Kramatorsk says, again, Tim White here, showing some of the horrors of the incessant barrage by Russia on the city where thousands of citizens remain. And you can just see constant flashing from explosions taking place in the city there, as in this nocturnal bit of footage just showing the explosions in and over Kramatorsk. Okay. So then we're going to move on to the Flex facility in Zakarpattia, which is an American civilian kind of commercial. It's not part of the military industrial base. In fact, the Russians have even admitted that. The propagandists said that we've taken out this American business investment. So it's not, otherwise they would have said we've taken out this part of the military industrial complex. They didn't say that. So Mukachevo here has been finally extinguished after a third day of fires there. 13 Ukrainian rescue workers spent 3 days battling a fire that consumed 7,000 square meters of an American-owned factory. And Trump was finally challenged on this. I wouldn't say challenged, he was asked about it. And he said, yeah, I heard about that. I'm not very happy. And that was his answer. Well, whoop-de-doo. You really strong leader, you. Really standing up for American interests abroad there. Yeah, I'm not happy about that. Next question. So anyway, we'll come to more on that later. So the Ukrainians last night had widespread attacks, but yet again, we don't have too much detail on what took place. So I'm hoping that the Ukrainians are having just huge impact on Russian, I don't know, whatever it is, military targets, logistics, hydrocarbons, whatever it may be that they're firing at. What we do know, or what we're led to believe, is that there are wide-scale drone attacks going into a number of different places here. This is quite an interesting one, going towards Georgia and the Caspian Sea here, so in the Caucasus sort of area, North Caucasus. At this moment, a massive attack, said Vision last night, by Ukrainian kamikaze drones is being reported in the North Caucasus, where loud explosions are being heard in several cities, but again, not too much detail. And then we hear that Moscow and St. Petersburg, there were drones going towards there. Russian monitoring channels are picking up that Ukrainian kamikaze drones are attacking the Moscow and Leningrad regions, where warning sirens have been activated and explosions can be heard. And Drone Bomber had this map that looked absolutely chaotic. It looked like a hurricane of drones, sort of going all sorts of areas, but again, down to the well, actually, in this case, Krasnodar region, just across from Kerch Bridge, northern Crimea, right across into Volgograd sort of areas, and then up into Voronezh here, and Belgorod on the way up to sort of Moscow, potentially St. Petersburg. So who knows what was actually struck, though. We really aren't hearing much apart from this. Oil refineries, a series of explosions thundered in the city of Abinsk, the villages of Ilsky and Afipsky in Krasnodar Krai. According to preliminary data, the air defense system was activated. According to local residents, a total of about 10 explosions were heard over populated areas. A loud sound set off alarms in cars and made the walls and houses shake. Eyewitnesses also heard the sound of Ukrainian drones flying overhead. There's currently no official information about casualties or damage. So it could be because, you know, there are refineries that have been actually struck before there. Ilsky and Afipsky have both been, I think there are refineries or depots there that have been struck previously. So it could be the Ukrainians were after them again. We know that they are up for multiple strikes on the same place. So once they start fixing it, they hit it again. One thing that might well have been hit last night was railway logistics. So we're hearing that a fire is reported at Attrition substation of the railway north of Milarovo in the Rostov region. And that's caught on firms data. War Translated says of this, Ukrainian forces have continued to strike the railway section between Rosok and Sokranovka with hits on the 21st and the 23rd of August, so last night as well. Over 3 days, 159 trains were delayed. Monitoring groups also report a fire at Traxon substation north of Milarovo, based on satellite imagery. So that's there. But look at all of these explosions that have taken place. I did a video on the railway infrastructure being targeted explicitly by the Ukrainians the other day. Go and check that out. It's still relevant now. If you haven't seen it already. Ukrainian drones targeted Russian railway infrastructure overnight. So this is a separate one, as far as I can work out, with strikes reported near Petroval in Volgograd. So not in Rostov, not in Milarovo, and it's another place. A fire broke out in the area of the railway station, but no more finer detail than that. And then we're going to go on to stuff that happened previously, just more data on it. Now, Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery has been burning. I think it's the fourth day it's on fire. If you remember, some places are very difficult to put out. It was Atlas oil depot, was on fire for something like 14 days. Absolutely hammered the oil reserves there. That was obviously some time ago. This took place 3 or 4 nights ago, and you are seeing that it is still on fire today. In fact, this is the most recent image, so it's hugely on fire, and I believe it's moved to. So, most people are claiming it's a refinery, but it obviously has oil storage there as well, so it's a depot too. And we'll see from satellite imagery that it's hard to see because smoke is covering it, but it could be that a good half of those oil containers have burnt, and they're just moving along the oil containers. I don't know, or it could just be the 3 in the middle here. Who knows? So there's a substantial, I think, impact to Novoshakhtinsk, no matter what. As you can see here, that's happening today, and it's moving on to other containers. Then they are unable to contain that fire. Even after 3 days, Russian authorities have not been able to stop the fire at Novoshakhtinsk refinery. Ukraine's drone attacks have been the single biggest sanctions program on Russia, says Tendar, the German analyst there And Chris O'Wiki has a thread here. Water supplies have been cut off in parts of Rostov region as firefighters struggle to deal with the ongoing fire at the Novochaktinsk refinery. Residents are incredulous at claims by the authorities that there's no problem with air quality. Novochaktinsk is in the location of the Rostov region's only oil refinery. It specializes in the production of fuel and heating oil, as well as marine and diesel fuel. The refinery is a key supplier of the Russian military, making it a very attractive target for the Ukrainians. As you can see here, you've got refinery infrastructure. I don't think those are the sort of tanks that are on fire, but they could be. You've got 2, 4, 6 on each side there. So if we look at the no, that's definitely not. So there is obviously somewhere else where there are those big containers. That's where Novochaktinsk is, in the Rostov Oblast, just north of Rostov-on-Don, and around Taganrog, so north of there. Sorry, just to go back to the thread. Following the drone attack on August 21st, the water pressure to residents has been reduced in Novochaktinsk and cut off entirely in nearby Krasny Sulin to ensure the firefighters have enough water. Residents also report severe air pollution. Quote, I live near the plant. Since what happened, it was impossible to open the windows, especially last night. And despite the fact that everything was closed in the apartment, my throat started to itch, my head hurts, and it's hard to breathe. Then the wind changed a little, this column moved a little, and the difference in the air quality immediately became obvious. Of course, no one will tell us the truth, so as not to disturb our feelings, even if after a while we start to grow horns or a third leg. Another resident replies sarcastically, and here we have everything wonderful and good. The water is drinkable. You can drink from the tap. The air is clean. Everything is within the normal range. The residents' cynicism about the authorities seems to be justified. City head Sergei Bondarenko says in his Telegram channel that tests show nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, suspended particles, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide comply with standards. So on and so forth. So, plant workers haven't been evacuated, and it's not looking good at Novochaktinsk, of course, which is good news for the Ukrainians, right? Now, another strike that I reported two days ago, then again yesterday, as more details came out. There is a drone is part of an airfield where drones were launched by Sevastopol, just on the western kind of headland that sticks out by Sevastopol. There's some Mohyzer 6 and 4 post. So big drones, big reconnaissance and drones that can find missiles that cover the Black Sea. This was their staging point. This was their launching point. That was hit by Ukrainians. Now we're actually seeing video evidence as well. So Ukrainian forces destroy Russian drone base in Crimea. The General Staff reported Ukraine's Navy struck a Russian drone base in the Kherson airfield in occupied Crimea. The strike destroyed up to 3 Mohyzer 6 and 2 4-post drones Russia has been using for reconnaissance over the Black Sea. So there you go. So more evidence of success there. Now, the European Commission has confirmed it's received a complaint from Hungary and Slovakia after the Druzhba pipeline attack, the third one on the Druzhba pipeline in recent weeks, which they called a threat to Russian oil supplies. Brussels said the incident does not affect EU security, energy security, and reminded states to keep emergency reserves. Obviously, the EU's got a difficult one here because Hungary and Slovakia are going to want to have energy security, and Ukraine has been stopping them from getting oil because the Ukrainians have taken out the pipeline which supplies them through Ukraine actually from Russia. But the EU is going to say, your EU member states, and that's bad for energy security, but what the hell are you doing buying Russian oil and still working hard to do so? We need to be weaning off Russian oil. In fact, these guys have vetoed attempts to have a quick cessation of Russian hydrocarbon demand, and that creates this real tension. So the Hungarians and Slovakians wrote a letter to the EU complaining. Viktor Orban wrote a letter to Trump, and this is a bit of an issue because Trump apparently is not happy with what the Ukrainians have done. So Viktor Orban sent this letter 5 days ago, just before a historic meeting between President Trump and Putin in Alaska. Ukraine carried out drone strikes on Druzhba oil pipeline in Russia. This pipeline supplies Hungary and Slovakia, two countries that have no other means of importing crude oil. Hungary supports Ukraine with electricity and petrol. In return, they bomb the pipeline that supplies us. Very unfriendly move. We wish President Trump every success in his pursuit for peace. So this is like, Trump, help us, and get really annoyed with Zelensky. Then Trump apparently writes this handwritten message back. Victor, I do not like hearing this. I am very angry about it. Tell Slovakia you are my great friend. Donald. And then signs it. Problem here, as Yaroslav Trofimov states, so let me get this straight. Trump is sanctioning India for buying Russian oil. So they whacked on these tariffs, which Scott Passant and others, even Peter Navarro, have been saying, yeah, this is all good. They shouldn't be buying Russian oil, which is the kind of thing we want to hear. But then he tells Viktor Orban he's very angry at Ukraine for disrupting on Russian territory the Russian pipeline that supplies oil to Hungary and Slovakia. There's no consistency here. So this is deeply hypocritical from Donald Trump. Someone needs to point that out to him very overtly, very explicitly in a presser. They need to say, hang on, you can't have a go at Ukraine for doing that when you are doing functionally the same thing with tariffs. You're not blowing up pipelines, but you're stopping oil from moving from A to B because you are whacking a secondary sanction on the country because they're moving fuel from A to B, so they won't move fuel from A to B. Insanity. Now, the Slovakian President Pellegrini has thanked Trump for his reaction to the strike on the Druzhba pipeline. Quote, I value his firm and negative stance regarding Ukraine's attack on the Druzhba oil pipeline, the energy infrastructure on which the people of Slovakia and our economy depend, Pellegrini said. Now, Pellegrini is a pro-Russian president, along with the pro-Russian Prime Minister Robert Fico. So this is unsurprising, but it's a real division that's annoying, and Trump is siding, it appears, with Slovakia and Hungary, much to the consternation, I'm sure, of the Ukrainians. Now, as I mentioned, well, let's listen here. We've got Trump being approached on the Flex facility here.
On that subject, have you talked to Vladimir Putin about the fact that yesterday a big US factory was hit in a Russian airstrike in Ukraine? What's your reaction to that?
I told him I'm not happy about it, and I'm not happy about anything having to do with that war. I said I settled 7 wars.
So we're going to talk about this. I don't have time now. I was going to include it on the end of here, but I don't have time. That was an absolute disaster of a press conference, or whatever you want to call it, a press gaggle. And it was directly reflective of the latest South Park episode that takes a mickey out of everything, all the criticisms I give, which is, in order to get Trump on side, you've got to bribe him. So you've got this procession of people going into the White House with gold and giving it to Trump. Well, most of the episode was dealing with that and AI, actually, of him just taking bribe after bribe, and this procession of people giving him gold and giving him trinkets. And this is where Infantino from FIFA brings along the World Cup, the big gold heavy World Cup trophy, trophy, and then Trump say, oh, can I keep that? And it's all a bit uncomfortable and whatnot, and he just wants to add it to his gold. And yeah, anyway, the whole thing was just a mess in terms of Ukraine. So we're going to go through that later. But anyway, so his answer to the Flex entity being here is really suboptimal. Russia may lose several major oil refineries forever due to drone attacks, as reported by the Moscow Times. So I was wondering about this myself, whether there would be a point where Russia goes, we either can't keep rebuilding this one, or like we don't want to because it's like a Sisyphean situation where we're just rolling the rock back up the hill again, only for it to fall back down, and then do it again, like repair it, gets blown up, repair it, gets blown up. You know, at some point, you know, the Russians might have to cut their losses with several refineries. So interesting. Right, there are a couple of bits I'm going to go through before we leave it. Most of these tabs we won't have time. Ukraine's population has shrunk by 10 million due to the war, and the main causes obviously are demographic crisis, and most of those people have just left. Then you've got record mortality, so you've got really high death rates. And then you've got really, really low birth rates because people are on the front line fighting rather than making babies. And if they're making babies, they're probably doing it in other countries, as in diaspora communities. So this is the issue with, and they've got an aging population. So this is an issue with regard to mobilization, because all of that makes mobilization even more difficult. Okay, Turchny have come up with an investigation that has exposed the extent of Moscow's construction of a huge spy station in Kaliningrad. So that's that exclave, Königsberg, as it was known, within 100 kilometers of Lithuanian Poland. Complex of radars has a 1 mile diameter, allowing Russia to eavesdrop deep into Europe. Pete Hegseth had never heard of Kaliningrad, so he's in charge of the Department of Defense. Go figure. Right, fuel issues for Russia, big time continuing. This, I think, is in Vladivostok. I'm sure someone says Primorsky Krai. I think is that. Anyway, only diesel fuel remains available at gas stations in Russia's Primorsky Krai, with no change to the regional shortage. Then you've got Yalta in Crimea. No fuel there at the gas stations being passed by this car. Then you've got no fuel in Novoshakhtinsk, which is on fire. It's bad news for the Russians there. We're going to go on to the rest of this kind of geopolitical stuff. I'm going to leave you with it being National Flag Day, the day before Independence Day. So is it 33 years or what of... Is my maths correct there? I'm sure someone said 33, 34, whatever. Not whatever. But Zelensky says, wherever you are in the world, and I did a video on flags, by the way, on Vexology, and we talked about the Ukrainian flag. I did it with the supporter of the channel, Tom Williamson, who's a friend of mine anyway. Used to run the Skeptic Canary podcast. He's knowledgeable on flags. He's a vexologist. And we talked about the Ukrainian flag being a really positive flag and imbuing a really positive sense of nationalism, like a good nationalism. Zelensky said, wherever you are in the world, whatever country you come to, when you notice a Ukrainian flag, you understand that who you're next to definitely has familiar hearts. That's how I translate that. It is this flag that is the feeling of salvation for the people we are returning from Russian captivity. The flag is the goal and dream of many of our people in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And they protect this flag. They protect it because they know we will not give our land to the occupier. This flag symbolizes the most precious thing for hundreds of thousands of our soldiers, men and women from all over Ukraine, who defend not only this or that particular direction, but all of our Ukraine, and risking their lives, fight for the right to life for our entire state. And may everyone who has made their own contribution to such a force of Ukrainian colours hear these words today, and these words are above all words of gratitude. Long live Ukraine, may our blue and yellow flag always be proud. Happy Flag Day, dear Ukrainians, glory to Ukraine. So happy Flag Day, and I will straighten my flag out a little bit behind me there and refer to that one back there. Happy days to the Ukrainian flag, and I'll leave you with Polish activists in Warsaw have painted the tarmac near the Russian embassy in the colours of the Ukrainian flag. So screw you, Russia. Take that in Warsaw. Toodle pips. Speak soon.